Hi everyone, and you are welcome to Public Access Modifier lecture. Let's start this lecture by a quick introduction to why we have to learn access modifiers. In real projects, in order to achieve a high level of abstraction, usually we control the user access to the different methods and attributes that the class has. In real projects, the user should be able to access only the main functionalities, and I mean by main functionalities here, attributes and methods that the class has, whereas other functionalities that support the main functionality should be hidden from the user and the external user should not be aware to. So, in order to control this access, we need access modifiers, and this is what we are going to learn about in this lecture and in the following two lectures. So let's get started. In this lecture, first of all, I'll define what an access modifier is. Then we will talk about the first type of these access modifiers, which is public access modifier. We will see the syntax of this access modifier. And at the end, I'll end up this lecture by a quick summary. So, what's an access modifier? Simply, access modifier is just a way to determine the scope within which we can access to an attribute or to a method. In other words, you can control if your methods and attributes are accessible within your class scope or out of your class scope. In Python, in OOP, there are three types of access modifier. We have public, protected, and private. And mainly in this lecture, we are talking about public access modifier. So, what's public access modifier? Very simple. When we say that this method or this attribute is public, we mean that we can use it out of the class scope. If you noted that, I use this concept class scope multiple times. So what I mean by class scope? Simply, class scope is just the methods that are defined within the class itself. So when I say the method or the attribute is public, this means they are accessible within the class scope or out of the class scope. Now let's talk about the syntax of this public access modifier. I need you to know that by default, everything is public inside Python. So if you want to define a class, for example, class name, and under this class you want to define some public methods and some public attributes, what you will do? First of all, you have to define your constructor, and within the constructor you will define your instance attributes, and look here, I call them public attr1 and public attr2 because by default they are public, so no need to do anything in order to make them public. And if you to define public methods, also all what you have to define is just the normal or the traditional methods that you have learned about before. As I mentioned before, everything by default is public and no need to change anything. So it's very simple. And now let's move to Jupyter Notebook to see some examples about public access modifier. Alright, first of all, what I need you to know that by default, everything is public. In other words, everything is accessible inside and outside of the class scope. Let me show you an example. I'll assume that I have a class, its name parent. It has a constructor in which I will define one instance attribute and it has one instance method, which is parent public method. And this method, all what it does, it just update the value of this instance attribute, which is parent public attribute. When I say everything is public, I mean that this attribute and these methods are accessible inside the class and outside the class. So what I mean by inside the class? I mean inside any method that's been defined inside the class itself. Before I define an object from this class, I want to add another class, which is child class. This child class, it's a simple class that inherits parent, and it has a single instance attribute, which is child public attribute, and two instance methods, which are child public method, which updates this instance attribute, and parent public method or print parent public method, which will print the parent public attribute. Now, let's see how we can get a public instance attribute. So what I mean by this? Let me define an object from the parent class. I will call it parent and I'll say parent. Oops. Okay, so I have to run this. Parent. And I can say simply out of the class scope, or in other words, out of any method inside this class, parent public attribute and run. You will see the value is 10. But what I need you to see here that I'm able to access and get the value of this attribute out of any method of these methods that under this class. I'm able to access it out of the class scope. We can do exactly the same thing, but now instead of defining an object from parent, let's define an object from child. And in this case, I'll define child and I'll say child.child public attribute. And run, you will get 15 because the value here is 15. Look here now, from this child object, if I call this method, which is print parent public method, and run, you will see I got 10 again. And you will note that this method will print the attribute that this child object inherits from the parent class. From this, we can understand that when the attribute is public, it's accessible from the children class's scopes and out of any children class's scope. Now let's see how we can set a public instance attribute out of the class scope. So again, I'll define here this object, but now before I print this value, I will say parent.parent public attribute equal to 25. If you run, you will get 25. So look here, because the attribute is public, you can access it and update the value out of the class scope. But I put a caution here for you. Don't do that. This is not recommended at all in object-oriented programming. Any instance attributes should be updated only within the class scope. And now the last idea that I want to share with you is how we can call a public instance method. It's quite easy, and already you have done this multiple times before, but this is just for the sake of understanding what's public access modifier. So I will define an object again, then I'll say parent dot, and let me see here what is the method name. It's parent public method, and let me run with dummy print statement. And you will see here, let me print the instance attribute, which is parent public attribute, and run. So you will see the value, it's a 20, because when I call this method, it will take the initial value and it multiplies this value by 2. And the takeaway point here that we can call any method out of the class scope. And I mean by this here the main scope. Why I am able to do that? Because again, everything by default is public, which means it's accessible anywhere. And that's exactly the meaning of public access modifier, which is the default behavior that you are already familiar with. Now let's recap what we have learned in this lecture. First of all, I started by defining what an access modifier is, and we see it's just a way to determine the scope within which we can access to an attribute or to a method. Next, we have learned about public access modifier, and we see that when we say that a method or an attribute is public, this means it can be accessed out of the class scope. After this, we talked about the syntax, and we see by default, everything is public and no need to do anything to make an attribute or a method public method or public attribute. Now please, I need you to refer to the challenges available after the lecture in order to practice what you have learned in this lecture. And now, thank you so much for your time, and if you are available, join me in the next lecture.